Happy 35th birthday, Julian. Open it. Julian Blackwood smiled warmly, his silver blue eyes softening as he looked across the candlelit table at his husband. The private dining room at the Ritz had been transformed into something out of a fairy tale. Roses everywhere in shades of deep crimson and pale blush. The soft glow of crystal chandeliers casting dancing shadows across the walls. A string quartet playing Vivaldi in the corner. Outside the floor-to-ceiling windows, the London skyline glittered like scattered diamonds against the velvet darkness of the night sky. It was exactly the kind of evening Julian had dreamed about when he was a young Omega, still learning to navigate a world that often told him he wasn't enough. "You've been acting mysterious all week," Julian teased, his voice carrying that particular warmth that only came from 15 years of intimacy. He tilted his head, studying his husband's face. "What is it this time?" Sebastian leaned back in his chair, adjusting the cuffs of his bespoke charcoal suit. His amber eyes held a glint that Julian couldn't quite read. "Go ahead," he said, his voice smooth as aged whiskey. "Open it." The thick cream envelope sat in the center of the table, tied with a gold silk ribbon that caught the candlelight. Julian's fingers trembled slightly as he untied it, not from fear, but from anticipation. Sebastian had never been particularly good with surprises, but when he tried beautifully. Last year, he had arranged a private concert with the London Symphony Orchestra. The year before, a weekend in Santorini. Julian had learned to expect the unexpected from his alpha husband, and this year's mystery had been building for weeks. The string quartet stopped playing mid-movement. More than 200 guests filled the ballroom beyond the private dining area. Executives, friends, family, and a carefully selected handful of journalists who had been promised an exclusive story about the golden couple of Blackwood Industries. Julian had wondered why Sebastian had insisted on such a public celebration for his 35th birthday. Now, as he pulled the first page from the envelope, he understood with a clarity that cut through him like a blade. Petition for dissolution of marriage. His fingers froze. The words blurred, then sharpened again with brutal precision. His Omega instincts, usually so calm, so controlled, so carefully managed in the boardrooms and negotiation tables where he had built his reputation, suddenly roared to life, screaming at him to fight, to flee, to do something, anything. His heart pounded against his ribs. His scent, normally soft lavender and honey, soured with shock. But Julian Blackwood had spent 15 years learning to silence those instincts when they served him poorly. He breathed. Once, twice, 3 times. He breathed until the roaring in his ears quieted and the world came back into focus. Silence swallowed the ballroom whole. Sebastian leaned forward, his amber eyes gleaming with something that looked almost like triumph. His alpha scent, usually warm and familiar, now carried an edge of aggression that made Julian's instincts prickle with unease. "I figured," Sebastian said loudly, his alpha voice carrying across the ballroom like a whip crack. "There's no better time to tell everyone the truth." A collective gasp rippled through the crowd. Glasses clinked as hands trembled. Someone dropped a fork, and the sound echoed obscenely in the silence. "Please tell me this is some kind of joke," Julian's closest friend, Marcus, whispered from a nearby table. His beta scent was sharp with distress, his face pale beneath his carefully styled dark hair. "It isn't," Sebastian replied before Julian could speak. He stood, adjusting his tie with the practiced ease of a man who had been performing for cameras for years, and lifted a wireless microphone from his pocket. "For years, everyone here has believed I had the perfect marriage." He laughed, a hollow, practiced sound that grated against Julian's ears. "I didn't." Julian looked up slowly, his Omega instincts finally quieting into something cold and calculating. He had been underestimated his entire life, by business rivals, by board members who thought Omegas belonged in the home, by anyone who mistook his softness for weakness. He had learned to weaponize that underestimation. He had learned to wait. Sebastian ignored him entirely. I've spent years pretending to be happy while living with an Omega who controls every part of my life. He gestured dramatically toward Julian, his arms sweeping across the candlelit table. He decides where we travel. He decorates our home. He manages every conversation. He manages my career. Do you know what it's like to have your alpha instincts constantly suppressed by an Omega who thinks he knows better than everyone else? Some guests exchanged uneasy looks. Others shifted in their seats, clearly uncomfortable with the increasingly public display. Julian stood slowly, his movements deliberate and graceful. His silk shirt, a pale lavender that matched his eyes, caught the candlelight. His Omega scent sharpened with controlled anger, but his voice remained steady. If this is because you're upset about the Geneva acquisition, we can discuss it privately. No. Sebastian's voice was a crack of thunder. Tonight, everyone deserves to know who you really are. No more hiding. No more pretending. I've been a prisoner in my own marriage long enough. Julian felt something inside him crack, but he held himself together with the iron will he had forged over years of being dismissed and underestimated. I've already done it. Sebastian gestured at the papers scattered across the table. I've signed every page. And before anyone judges me, he smiled, his alpha pride evident in every line of his body, the confident tilt of his chin, the possessive gleam in his amber eyes. I've also found someone who actually appreciates me. Someone who understands what it means to be with a real alpha. Someone who doesn't try to control every single breath I take. The ballroom erupted into whispers. Julian turned slowly, his Omega heart cracking in ways he didn't think possible. He looked across the room to where a young Omega stood, elegant, confident, devastatingly beautiful, wearing a fitted burgundy suit that accentuated his slender frame. Theodore Ashford, 28. A model from New York who had been gracing magazine covers and charity galas for the past 3 years. Julian recognized him immediately from the events Sebastian had been attending alone for the past 11 months. Theodore didn't look embarrassed. He smiled, a perfectly calibrated expression that suggested he had been expecting this moment. He raised his champagne glass in a small, almost mocking toast. The humiliation was absolute. Sebastian walked toward Theodore, placing his arm around the younger Omega's waist with possessive familiarity. Meet the Omega who reminds me what happiness feels like. The Omega who doesn't try to control every aspect of my existence. The Omega who actually appreciates what I have to offer. Julian stared, his Omega instincts screaming at him to submit, to cry, to make himself small and disappear. Instead, he reached deep inside himself, to the core of steel that had helped him save a failing company, negotiate impossible deals, and build an empire from nothing. You brought him here, Julian said, his voice barely above a whisper. To my birthday. To the celebration of my 35th year. You brought your affair to my birthday. I wanted honesty for once. Sebastian's alpha scent was thick with satisfaction, the scent of a predator who believed he had already won. I wanted closure. I wanted everyone to see the truth about our marriage. Julian lowered his eyes toward the divorce papers. For several seconds, he didn't move. He didn't cry. He simply breathed, feeling the weight of 15 years pressing down on him. 15 years of building a life together. 15 years of supporting Sebastian's ambitions, managing his career, smoothing over his mistakes. 15 years of love and patience and quiet sacrifice. Then, he folded the papers neatly, placed them back inside the envelope, and looked directly at Sebastian. And smiled. Not a broken smile. Not a nervous smile. A calm, almost peaceful smile that made something flicker in Sebastian's amber eyes, something that looked almost like fear. Sebastian frowned, his alpha instincts clearly confused by Julian's lack of submission. What are you smiling about? What could you possibly have to smile about right now? Julian looked around the ballroom, his Omega senses cataloging every scent, every expression, every whispered comment. I was just thinking, he said slowly, that this evening turned out exactly the way it needed to. The room became quiet again, the silence so complete that Julian could hear his own heartbeat. Theodore frowned, his omega scent tinged with confusion. He clearly hadn't expected this reaction either. Sebastian laughed, but it was forced, hollow. You've finally lost it. The shock has broken your mind completely. Maybe. Julian looked toward the orchestra. Gentlemen, please enjoy your dinner for a few more minutes. We have some business to attend to. The musicians looked at him, their omega and beta instincts recognizing something in his voice that commanded attention even without alpha aggression. They lowered their instruments, confused but compliant. Sebastian's confidence flickered, just for a moment. What are you doing? Julian ignored him, instead picking up his champagne glass and raising it to the assembled guests. I think everyone deserves another drink. This is going to be a long evening. His father-in-law, Arthur Blackwood, sat at the head table, his expression shifting from confusion to something more complex. Julian knew that look. He had seen it only once before. The day Julian had quietly restructured the company's entire logistics division to save it from collapse. Arthur's alpha instincts were screaming at him that something significant was about to happen. Sebastian laughed louder, trying to regain control of the situation. Look at him. He turned toward the guests, gesturing dismissively at Julian. He's pretending none of this is happening. He's going to try to make everyone feel sorry for him. That's what Omegas do when they're humiliated. They play the victim. Oh. Julian looked directly into his eyes, his omega scent suddenly sharp and cold, laced with something Sebastian had never smelled before. Something that made his alpha instincts prickle with warning. There is. Sebastian stepped forward, his eyes narrowing. What exactly are you talking about? You'll see. Julian's voice was silk over steel. Theodore stepped forward, his omega scent cloying with fake sympathy. Julian, he said, his voice dripping with condescension, you deserve someone who actually loves you. Someone who sees you for who you really are. I know this is hard, but you need to let Sebastian go. He's not happy with you. He hasn't been happy for a long time. Julian slowly turned, his silver blue eyes freezing the younger Omega in place. You must be Theodore. Theodore smiled, clearly expecting Julian to crumble. I've heard so much about you. Sebastian talks about you constantly. I feel like I know you already. I'm sure you have. Julian's voice was ice. I never wanted to hurt you, Julian. Theodore's expression was perfectly crafted sympathy. I truly didn't. I just... Really? Julian tilted his head, his omega instincts finally finding solid ground. Then why are you here? At my birthday celebration? Why are you standing in front of my husband, in front of my friends and family, wearing that smug expression if you didn't want to hurt me? Theodore glanced at Sebastian, clearly unprepared for Julian's directness. Sebastian answered instead. Because he has nothing to hide. Because he's an honest Omega who deserves respect. Julian nodded slowly. Interesting. Sebastian folded his arms, his alpha scent growing more aggressive. You know what's interesting? You still haven't signed. What are you waiting for? A miracle. I've had less than 5 minutes to read through divorce papers, Sebastian. I think I'm entitled to a moment to process. You don't need 5 minutes to sign divorce papers. You just need to accept the reality of the situation. I read contracts before signing them. Julian's omega instinct sharpened. This was familiar ground. Contract negotiation. Strategic positioning. He could do this all day. I've learned that lesson the hard way, Sebastian. Remember the time you almost signed that terrible acquisition deal without reading the fine print? I had to fix that for you. Sebastian smirked, trying to regain his alpha dominance. You won't find anything. The papers are exactly what they appear to be. I've had my lawyers review them. They're ironclad. Julian smiled again, his sense steady and controlled. I'm not looking for mistakes. What then? Julian looked toward the ballroom entrance, his omega instincts tingling with anticipation. I'm looking for timing. Arthur's eyes narrowed. Timing. The single word hung in the air like a sword. Sebastian scoffed, his sense spiking with frustration. You've always loved playing games. It's one of the things I despise most about you. Your constant need to be the smartest person in every room. No. Julian looked back toward the entrance, his heart beating steadily. I've simply learned patience. I've learned to wait for the right moment. Sebastian followed his gaze, saw only hotel staff, guests, waiters, the usual bustle of a high-end event. You're hoping someone walks through that door and saves you. Some alpha who's going to ride in and rescue the poor damsel Omega from his cruel husband. That's pathetic. Julian answered quietly, his Omega voice steady as steel. No, I'm waiting for someone to arrive. Someone I invited. Someone who's been preparing for this moment for the past 93 days. Theodore folded his arms, his Omega scent mocking. Who? Who could possibly be coming to save you, Julian? Your parents are dead, and you don't have any siblings. Some former lover. Julian checked the elegant platinum watch on his wrist, a gift from his mother before she passed. They're actually, he smiled softly, right on time. Perfect as always. The ballroom doors slowly opened. Everyone turned. 3 people walked inside. A silver-haired beta attorney carrying a leather briefcase and looking exceptionally competent. A middle-aged Omega holding a thick folder and wearing a determined expression, and a young alpha technician wheeling in a projector case and looking nervous about the attention. Sebastian's smile disappeared entirely. His heartbeat quickened, audible in the profound silence. He whispered, "Who are those people?" Julian finally looked him in the eyes, and his gaze was like winter. The reason I never interrupted your speech. The reason I let you humiliate me in front of everyone. The reason I let you believe you'd won. The attorney walked directly toward Julian, handing him a sealed envelope with a respectful nod. Julian thanked him politely, his Omega instincts humming with satisfaction. Arthur slowly stood, his alpha instincts screaming that something fundamental had shifted. Julian. His voice was uncertain for the first time. Julian calmly opened the envelope. You wanted everyone to know the truth, he said, his voice carrying across the silent ballroom. I think that's a wonderful idea. He removed several documents, each bearing official seals and signatures. I think everyone should know the truth. The complete truth. The truth you've been hiding from everyone for 15 years. He looked toward every guest in the ballroom, making eye contact with each of them in turn. So let's tell them everything. The projector screen began descending from the ceiling, a soft whirring sound that seemed deafening in the tense silence. Sebastian's face went pale. He suddenly didn't feel like the alpha in control anymore. His sense soured with anxiety. The projector screen stopped halfway, lowering completely into place. Every conversation died instantly. Sebastian forced a laugh, but his alpha scent was already betraying him with its sharp edge of fear. So this is your big comeback? A projector? Some documents? What are you going to do? Show everyone our wedding photos? Julian didn't answer him. Instead, he turned to the technician. Would you please connect the laptop? We have a presentation to show. Of course, Mr. Blackwood. The Omega technician nodded respectfully and began setting up the equipment with practiced efficiency. Theodore leaned closer to Sebastian and whispered, his Omega voice barely audible. He's bluffing. He has to be bluffing. What could he possibly have? Sebastian nodded, though he didn't sound convinced. He has to be. I've been careful. I've covered everything. Arthur remained standing, his eyes never leaving Julian. Unlike everyone else in the room, he wasn't wondering what Julian was about to reveal. He was wondering how much Julian knew. His alpha instincts had always told him that his daughter-in-law was far more perceptive than he let on. Julian accepted the wireless microphone from the attorney, his movements calm and deliberate. First, he said, his voice clear and steady. I'd like to thank every one of you for attending what has become a very unforgettable birthday. I can promise you that none of us will forget this evening. A few uncomfortable chuckles echoed through the room, quickly stifled. I know many of you expected tears. Julian smiled faintly, his Omega scent soft but determined. I almost disappointed myself. There was a moment there where I thought I might actually break down in front of all of you. Sebastian smirked, trying to regain his alpha dominance. There he is, finally admitting he lost. Finally breaking down and playing the victim. Julian looked at him. Did I? The question was simple, loaded with meaning. The projector flickered to life. A single image appeared on the screen. A wedding photograph taken 15 years earlier, both of them young and hopeful and incredibly naive. Julian's Omega instincts had been so eager to please back then, so desperate to prove himself worthy of an alpha's love. He had given everything to this marriage. And now he was about to show everyone exactly what that had cost. Sebastian frowned, clearly confused. What is this supposed to prove? That we were happy once? That we got married? Everyone here knows that. Julian ignored him. 15 years ago, this picture was taken the week after our wedding. We were young, we were in love, and we believed we could conquer the world together. He looked around the room. Back then, Sebastian wasn't a CEO. He wasn't even a vice president. He was a junior executive with big dreams and no idea how to achieve them. Another image appeared, a small office with old desks, boxes stacked in corners, the Blackwood Industries logo looking worn and outdated. Back then, Blackwood Industries was carrying debt that almost forced it into liquidation. The company was bleeding money. Employees were being let go. The board was considering bankruptcy. Several older executives exchanged surprised looks. They remembered those difficult years, the fear and uncertainty that had gripped the company. Sebastian laughed nervously, his alpha scent spiking with anxiety. What does this have to do with anything? That's ancient history. We all know the company went through a rough patch. That's not exactly news. Everything. Julian clicked the remote. A financial statement appeared on the screen. Numbers, losses, bank notices, default warnings, the kind of documents that made executives sweat. This is the financial state of Blackwood Industries 15 years ago. We were months away from collapse. Whispers spread across the ballroom. One executive murmured, "I remember this. I thought we were done for." Another nodded. "We almost lost everything. I had already started updating my resume." Sebastian's face tightened, his alpha instincts screaming at him to stop this. "Julian, what are you doing? These documents are confidential." Julian looked directly at him. "Do you remember the emergency board meeting that everyone still talks about? The one where someone stood up and promised to save the company?" "Of course I do." Sebastian's alpha scent was defensive. "You gave a speech afterward. You were the one who—" "I did. And you said you had found a way to save the company. You took all the credit. You stood before the board and the employees and promised salvation." Sebastian smiled, his alpha scent finally relaxing. "Because I did save the company. I'm the one who found the investor." "No." Julian's voice was quiet but devastating. "You didn't." The room fell silent again. Sebastian's smile disappeared, replaced by something that looked almost like panic. "What? You didn't save Blackwood Industries. You didn't find the investor. You didn't secure the funding. You didn't restructure the debt. You didn't negotiate the deals that kept us afloat." Sebastian laughed louder, but his scent was sour with anxiety. "Now you're rewriting history. This is ridiculous. Everyone knows I saved the company." Julian slowly lifted another document, holding it up so the projector could capture it. "My father passed away 6 months before that crisis." His voice softened with memory, with grief. "He was a brilliant Omega, a real estate developer who had built an empire from nothing. He left me a trust fund." Several guests listened carefully, leaning forward in their seats. "I had planned to use that trust fund to open my own design firm. It was my dream, the thing I had been working toward my entire life." He paused, letting the weight of his words settle. "But then I saw my husband's family struggling. I saw the company collapsing. I saw employees terrified of losing their jobs, families terrified of losing their homes. And I made a choice." Arthur lowered his head. He already knew exactly where this was going. "So," Julian continued, his voice steady, "I liquidated nearly everything I inherited. Every penny, every asset, everything my father had worked his entire life to build. I gave it all to Blackwood Industries." Another document appeared on the screen, a wire transfer confirmation, millions of pounds, recipient, Blackwood Industries. The numbers were staggering. The room gasped. Sebastian's breathing became heavier, his alpha scent sharp with panic. No. Julian clicked again. Signed loan guarantees. Investment agreements. Private contracts. Each carried his signature. Each bore his name. I invested my inheritance to save the company. I poured my future into this family, into this marriage, into building something together. Someone in the crowd whispered, "My God." An elderly board member slowly stood, his eyes fixed on the screen. I remember these documents. He looked toward Arthur. You told us the investor wanted to remain anonymous. You said it was someone who believed in the company's mission. Arthur nodded once, his voice heavy. He did. He wanted no recognition. He said the only thing that mattered was saving the company. Every eye turned toward Julian. He smiled politely, his Omega instincts finally satisfied. I never wanted recognition. I never wanted praise. I believed a marriage meant building together. I believed we were a partnership. He looked toward Sebastian. So, I let everyone believe you were the hero. I let you take the credit. I stood in the background while you received awards, bonuses, promotions. I smiled and clapped and told everyone how proud I was of you. The ballroom became painfully quiet, the weight of 15 years of lies pressing down on everyone present. One executive shook his head. All these years, we all thought Sebastian was the one who saved us. Another whispered, we applauded the wrong person. Sebastian finally snapped, his alpha scent exploding with aggression and denial. So what? He stepped forward, his voice booming. Everyone turned. So you loaned the company money. Big deal. It doesn't change anything. It doesn't change who I am or what I've built. Julian looked at him with something that might have been pity. That's your defense? That you stole someone else's work and it doesn't matter? Sebastian ignored the comment, his alpha instincts driving him forward. You still couldn't satisfy me as an Omega. You still couldn't give me what I needed. Several guests frowned, openly uncomfortable with the personal attack. Arthur closed his eyes briefly. Even he seemed embarrassed by his son's words. Julian remained calm, his Omega instinct steady. I wondered how long it would take before you made this personal. I wondered how long before you abandoned logic and went straight to the insults. Sebastian pointed toward Theodore, his alpha scent aggressively possessive. I found someone who appreciates me. Someone who understands that an alpha needs to be appreciated. Theodore smiled awkwardly, his Omega scent suddenly nervous under the weight of so many eyes. Julian nodded. I'm sure he appreciates what he thinks you own. I'm sure he appreciates the money you spend on him. I'm sure he appreciates the lifestyle you provide. Theodore's smile faded. What does that mean? Julian ignored him, clicking the remote again. This time the screen displayed ownership records. Property after property after property. Commercial buildings. Hotels. Luxury apartments. Land. The list seemed endless. Guests leaned forward, craning their necks to see the details. Sebastian frowned, his alpha instincts screaming warning. What are you doing, Julian? What is this supposed to prove? Julian answered softly, his Omega voice barely above a whisper, but carrying through the absolute silence. Showing everyone who actually owns them. A highlighted section appeared, registered owner, Julian Blackwood. Another, joint ownership with Julian Blackwood. Another, purchased through Julian Blackwood Family Trust. Another, sole owner, Julian Blackwood. Theodore's eyes widened dramatically. He looked toward Sebastian, his Omega scent souring with confusion. You told me those were yours. You told me the penthouse was yours. You told me the beach house was yours. They are. Julian interrupted. No. He clicked again. A beautiful beachfront mansion appeared, the kind that graced the covers of luxury magazines. This is the house in Malibu. The one you took Theodore to for your romantic weekend 3 months ago. Theodore smiled nervously. I've been there. It was beautiful. Julian nodded. I know you have. I have the hotel records. Theodore froze. The house belongs to me. It's in my name. It was purchased with my trust fund. Sebastian had no part in acquiring it. Another document appeared, the penthouse in Manhattan. Julian's name. Another, the vacation chalet in Switzerland. Julian's name. Another, the luxury vineyard in Tuscany. Julian's name. The whispers grew louder. He owns everything. Sebastian doesn't own anything. How did he hide this for so long? Sebastian clenched his fists, his alpha scent aggressive and threatening. This proves nothing. It just means you're good at paperwork. Julian looked directly at him, his gaze relentless. It proves you enjoyed introducing another Omega to homes he believed belonged to you. It proves you built your entire relationship with Theodore on lies. It proves you offered him a future that wasn't yours to give. Theodore slowly stepped away from Sebastian, his Omega instincts finally overriding his ambition. Sebastian, what is he talking about? Sebastian grabbed his arm. Don't listen to him. He's trying to manipulate you. Julian clicked again. Company records appeared on the screen, board resolutions, expansion strategies, acquisition plans, all bearing his initials. One board member couldn't stay quiet any longer. Wait. He adjusted his glasses, peering at the screen. I recognize those documents. Those are the strategic plans that doubled our revenue. Those are the expansion strategies that saved us during the recession. Those are the acquisition plans that made us a global player. Arthur nodded gravely. They are. The executive looked at Julian in disbelief. You wrote these? You created these strategies? I did. Every single one of them. I wrote them in the middle of the night while Sebastian was sleeping. I sent them to the board anonymously. I signed them with my initials because I knew someone would eventually trace them back to me. Sebastian quickly interrupted, his alpha voice booming across the ballroom. I supervised them. I approved them. Julian smiled, his Omega instincts sharp. You approved them after changing the font. You approved them after deleting my recommendations and adding your own. You approved them after making sure everyone thought they came from you. Laughter burst from several corners of the ballroom, quickly stifled. Sebastian's face turned red, his alpha scent spiking with humiliation. One executive whispered to another, I remember now. I remember receiving those documents directly from him. I thought they were just draft proposals, but they were. Another replied, he's serious. He's been running this company from the shadows for years. More memories began surfacing. He solved the Chicago merger and the Dallas negotiations. He redesigned our entire logistics division. He saved us during the financial crisis. I thought Sebastian did all of that. Arthur finally spoke, his alpha voice cutting through the noise like a blade. No. Everyone became silent. Arthur looked at his son, his expression heavy with disappointment and regret. My son presented the ideas. He looked at Julian, his eyes softening with something that looked almost like awe. He created them. Sebastian stared at his father. Dad, Arthur's voice was filled with pain. I asked you years ago if you deserved the praise. I asked you if you had truly earned the credit I was giving you. I asked you if there was anything you wanted to tell me about the company's success. Sebastian swallowed hard, his alpha instincts finally recognizing the trap closing around him. You told me. I know what I told you. Arthur interrupted, his voice steel. I told you to be honest with me. And you weren't. You lied to my face. You lied to everyone. You let an Omega save everything we'd built. And then you spent 15 years pretending you were the hero. Theodore looked back and forth between the two alphas, his Omega confidence disappearing rapidly. He quietly asked Sebastian, Is this true? All of it. Sebastian looked away, unable to meet Theodore's eyes. Julian watched silently, his Omega instincts finally satisfied. Then he reached into another folder, pulling out a thick stack of documents. I've shown everyone who helped build the company, he said, his voice calm. I've shown everyone who really saved Blackwood Industries. He placed the folder on the table, the documents inside clearly labeled and organized. But none of that is why we're here tonight. The room became still again, every guest holding their breath. Sebastian frowned, his alpha instincts screaming that something was wrong. What are you talking about? What else could there be? Julian's Omega voice was steady, unwavering. I promised myself something 3 months ago. What? That if you ever try to destroy me publicly, if you ever try to humiliate me in front of the people we love. Julian slowly lifted another envelope. This one thicker than the rest, and sealed with red wax. I'd let everyone see the alpha behind the mask. I'd let everyone see who you really are. Sebastian's heart beat quickened, his alpha instincts in full panic. What envelope is that? What are you hiding? Julian didn't answer immediately. Instead, he looked toward the attorney. Mr. Harrison, would you please tell everyone when I first contacted your office? The attorney opened his file, adjusting his glasses. I received Mr. Blackwood's instructions exactly 93 days ago. The ballroom erupted into murmurs. 93 days. Julian had known for 3 months. He had been preparing for this moment for an entire season. Sebastian stared at him, his alpha instincts finally recognizing the true threat. You knew? You knew all of this, and you didn't say anything? Julian's voice was quiet steel. I knew enough. You followed me. No. Julian looked directly into his eyes. You became careless. You became arrogant. You assumed I was too weak, too passive, too omega to ever fight back. You assumed I would crumble and disappear. You underestimated me one too many times. The attorney removed another stack of papers, each one tabbed and organized. I was instructed to verify financial transfers, business communications, hotel records, and other relevant information. He paused, looking around the room. What we discovered was comprehensive. Theodore's breathing became shallow, his omega instincts screaming at him to flee. Sebastian didn't respond, his eyes fixed on the envelope in Julian's hands. Julian gently placed one hand on the envelope, his fingers tracing the red wax seal. I've already shown everyone who built your success. I've already shown everyone who really saved this company. He looked around the ballroom one guest at a time, making eye contact with each of them. Now, his voice dropped almost to a whisper. It's time everyone learns how close you came to destroying everything. He broke the seal on the envelope. Sebastian took an involuntary step backward, his alpha instincts finally recognizing the threat for what it was. For the first time that night, he looked genuinely afraid. The first photograph appeared on the projector screen, Sebastian and Theodore in a luxury restaurant, their hands intertwined across the table. The date was visible, 3 months ago. Another image appeared, Sebastian handing Theodore keys to the penthouse in Manhattan. Another, the two of them aboard a private yacht in the Mediterranean. Another, a jewelry store on Fifth Avenue. Another, a private dinner in Paris. Another, the two of them in a hotel suite in Dubai. Theodore covered his mouth, his eyes wide with horror. Oh no. Sebastian's eyes widened, his alpha scent sharp with panic. Where did you get those? Those were private. Those were supposed to be. Julian ignored him, his omega instincts focused entirely on control. His voice was calm, measured, devastating. I could have exposed this months ago, Theodore. He paused. But infidelity wasn't the worst thing you did, Sebastian. Sebastian swallowed hard. What are you talking about? What could possibly be worse than this? Julian clicked again. Financial records appeared on the screen, company expense reports, invoices, credit card statements, one after another after another. The numbers were staggering. The attorney spoke, his voice carrying through the silent ballroom. Our independent audit discovered that over the last 11 months, more than £2 million in corporate funds were used for personal purposes. He paused. These were not expenses. These were theft. The room erupted again, gasps and whispers filling every corner. Sebastian quickly answered, his alpha voice defensive. Those were executive expenses. I'm the CEO, I'm entitled to. The attorney calmly shook his head. They were not. Executive expenses are documented, approved, and reported. These were hidden. These were deliberately concealed from the board and the finance department. Julian looked toward the guests, his omega voice steady and devastating. The jewelry. Click. The vacations. Click. The hotel suites. Click. The luxury vehicle leased for Mr. Theodore Ashford. Click. The designer handbags. Click. The private flights. Click. The restaurant bills. Click. The clothing. Click. The gifts. Click. Every single purchase. Click. was paid for by Blackwood Industries. Every single purchase was stolen from the employees who worked overtime, from the shareholders who trusted this company, from the families whose bonuses were reduced because expenses were mysteriously increasing. Theodore's eyes filled with panic, his omega scent sharp with fear. He turned toward Sebastian, his voice shaking. You told me those gifts came from your own account. You told me you had personal money. You told me. They practically did. No. Julian interrupted, his voice ice. They came from the employees who worked overtime. He looked around the room. They came from shareholders who trusted this company. He looked back at Theodore. And they came from families whose bonuses were reduced because expenses were mysteriously increasing. Families who had children to feed, mortgages to pay, dreams to build. Theodore's breathing became uneven. I didn't know. I swear I didn't know. Julian nodded, his omega instincts recognizing the truth in Theodore's scent. I believe you didn't know about the company funds. Sebastian immediately interrupted, his alpha scent aggressive and desperate. Stop trying to make yourself look noble. Stop trying to make yourself the victim. Julian ignored him, his eyes fixed on Theodore. But you did know he was married. Theodore couldn't answer, his omega instincts screaming with shame. You knew he planned to humiliate me tonight. Julian's voice was gentle but unyielding. You knew he planned to destroy me in front of everyone I love. You knew, and you came anyway. You dressed up and smiled, and raised your glass to my humiliation. Still no answer from Theodore. His omega scent was bitter with regret. You laughed about it. Julian's voice was soft, almost sad. You thought it was funny. You thought I deserved it. Tears formed in Theodore's eyes, his omega instincts finally overwhelmed. I thought you were holding him back. You thought I deserved it. Theodore lowered his head, unable to meet Julian's eyes. Julian didn't insult him. He didn't yell at him. He simply looked away, his omega heart aching not for himself, but for the young omega who had been used and manipulated. That silence hurt far more than any angry words could have. Sebastian slammed his fist on the table, his alpha scent exploding with rage and desperation. This is ridiculous. This is a waste of everyone's time. He pointed at Julian, his hand shaking. You've spent months spying on me. You've been scheming and plotting and trying to destroy me. No. Julian answered immediately, his omega instincts sharp and clear. I spent months protecting what you were trying to destroy. I spent months making sure that when you finally pushed too far, when you finally went too public, I had the evidence to save everything you were trying to burn down. Arthur finally spoke again, his alpha voice commanding. What exactly was he trying to destroy, Julian? Julian slowly turned toward him, his silver blue eyes steady. The company. The room froze, the silence absolute. Sebastian laughed loudly, but his alpha scent was thick with desperation. Now that's insane. That's absolutely insane. Why would I destroy my own company? Is it? Julian clicked again. A confidential acquisition proposal appeared on the screen, one that made several board members gasp. One of the board members stood immediately, his face pale. That's classified. That's the most sensitive document in the company. It was. Julian nodded. Until someone emailed it outside the company. Another click. An email appeared on the screen. Sender, Sebastian Blackwood. Recipient, a competing corporation in the United States. The room became deathly silent. Sebastian's mouth fell open, his alpha instincts in full panic. That's impossible. The attorney spoke, his voice steady. Our forensic IT specialists verified the email, its headers, its IP addresses, and its digital signatures. There is no possibility of error. Sebastian looked around desperately. It's fake. Someone forged it. Someone planted it. Another document appeared. IP addresses, login records, digital signatures, timestamps. Everything was documented. Everything was undeniable. I'm sorry, Dad, Sebastian whispered, his voice barely audible. Arthur looked at his son with anguish. I know. I'm sorry. I know. Sebastian's voice grew louder, more desperate. It wasn't like that. It wasn't about destroying the company. I needed investors for a project I was working on, a side project. His alpha composure finally cracked entirely. He exploded, his scent flooding the ballroom with rage and desperation. I needed investors. You needed money. I deserved more than what I was getting. You were already CEO. Arthur shouted back, his own alpha instincts finally overcoming his control. You had everything anyone could want. It wasn't enough. Sebastian's voice was a roar. I was tired of everyone treating Julian like he was perfect. He pointed at his husband, his hands shaking. He always had the answers. He always fixed everything. My own father listened to him more than me. My board listened to him more than me. My employees listened to him more than me. I was the CEO, but everyone wanted Julian. Arthur whispered, his voice breaking. Because he earned it. Sebastian ignored him completely, his alpha instincts driving him forward. I wanted one deal that was mine. One deal that no one could take away from me. One deal that everyone would remember as Sebastian's triumph. He looked around the room, his expression wild. So I negotiated with another company. I found investors who would back my vision, my future, my empire. Julian quietly finished the sentence, his omega voice devastating in its calmness. In exchange for a personal payment. In exchange for betraying the trust of everyone who believed in you. Sebastian didn't deny it. He couldn't. The evidence was everywhere, undeniable and damning. The silence became unbearable, pressing down on everyone in the ballroom. Arthur looked as though his heart had been torn from his chest. You sold out your own company, he whispered, his voice hollow. You sold out everything we've built. Everything your mother and I worked for. Everything Julian sacrificed for. Sebastian looked at his father with anger instead of regret, his alpha instincts refusing to accept defeat. I built that company. I was the one who. Arthur's eyes filled with disappointment, so profound it seemed to age him a decade. No. He slowly pointed toward Julian. He helped save it. He poured everything he had into this family, into this company, into you. Then he pointed toward the employees standing around the ballroom, their faces pale with shock. They built it. Day after day, year after year, they gave their best to Blackwood Industries. Finally, he pointed at himself. And I started it. I built it from nothing, with nothing but sweat and hope and determination. His voice hardened, his alpha instincts finally turning on his own son. But you. He took a deep breath, the words visibly painful. You almost destroyed everything our family stood for. Everything we worked for. Everything we believed in. No one moved. No one even breathed. Arthur reached inside his suit jacket, his hand trembling slightly. He removed a sealed envelope, the kind that only the most serious corporate documents came in. Julian looked surprised, his omega instincts detecting something he hadn't anticipated. So, Sebastian whispered, his alpha instincts finally recognizing defeat. You knew. You knew everything. And you said nothing. Arthur looked at his son, his eyes filled with pain. I prayed every single day that I was wrong. I prayed that my son was better than this. I prayed that the evidence I'd been finding was a mistake. He handed the envelope to the chairman of the board, his hand steadying. It appears, he said quietly, that I wasn't. The chairman opened the envelope, his eyes scanning the document. After what felt like an eternity, he slowly stood, his expression grave. Ladies and gentlemen. He cleared his throat. This document contains the unanimous decision of the Blackwood Industries Board of Directors. Sebastian's heartbeat pounded in his ears, his alpha instincts in full revolt. What decision? What are you talking about? The chairman looked directly at him, his eyes unwavering. The decision we hoped we would never have to make. The ballroom fell completely silent. The chairman looked around the silent ballroom before unfolding the final page. His voice was steady, carrying through the absolute quiet. Effective immediately, by unanimous vote of the Board of Directors of Blackwood Industries. He paused, letting the words sink in. Sebastian Blackwood is hereby removed as Chief Executive Officer. No. Sebastian's voice was a whisper, his alpha instincts refusing to accept what he was hearing. No, this isn't happening. The chairman continued, his voice implacable. All executive authority is terminated immediately. Access to company accounts, systems, and corporate facilities is revoked, pending a full internal investigation. Any and all company property in Mr. Blackwood's possession must be returned within 24 hours. Sebastian slammed both hands on the table, his alpha instincts in full revolt. You can't do this. You don't have the authority. The chairman calmly replied. It has already been done. Sebastian spun toward his father, his voice cracking with desperation. Dad, tell them this is a joke. Tell them you don't mean it. Arthur looked at him with tears in his eyes, his alpha instincts finally breaking. I wish I could. I wish I could tell you this is a terrible dream, and we're all going to wake up tomorrow. You own this company. You have the shares. I own enough shares to protect it. Then stop this. Use your shares. Use your vote. Arthur slowly shook his head, his voice breaking. I spent 40 years building Blackwood Industries. His voice cracked, raw with emotion. I will not spend the rest of my life watching my own son destroy it. I won't let that happen. I can't let that happen. Sebastian stepped closer, his alpha scent aggressively challenging. You'd choose him over me? You'd choose an Omega over your own son? Arthur looked directly into his son's eyes, and for a moment, his expression was just a father looking at his child. No, he answered quietly. I'm choosing integrity over betrayal. I'm choosing what's right over what's easy. His voice hardened. I'm choosing the company that feeds thousands of families over the selfish ambition of one man. The chairman nodded. The board has also voted to appoint an interim chief executive officer. Every guest leaned forward, the tension unbearable. Sebastian laughed bitterly, his alpha scent sour with defeat. So who's replacing me? Who's going to take the throne I've been sitting on for 15 years? Some board member? Some executive who doesn't know what he's doing? The answer is unanimous. The chairman looked toward Julian, his expression respectful. Mr. Julian Blackwood. The ballroom erupted. Some guests stood instinctively, their omega and beta instincts recognizing the rightness of the moment. Others applauded before realizing how emotional the moment had become, tears streaming down their faces. Still others simply stared in amazement at the Omega who had just taken everything back. Julian remained seated, his Omega instincts completely overwhelmed. Mr. Chairman. The chairman smiled, his expression warm. The board believes no one is more qualified. He paused. In fact, the board believes you've been doing this job for years. It's time you got the recognition you deserve. One director stood, his voice ringing out. I second that. Another followed. So do I. Then another. And I. Within seconds, every board member was standing, applauding wildly. Sebastian looked around the room. These were the same people who had applauded him just minutes earlier. Now, not one of them was looking at him. They were all looking at Julian. Sebastian pointed at Julian, his hand shaking with rage. He manipulated all of you. Don't you see? He's been planning this for months. He's been. An elderly board member answered immediately, his voice sharp. No, you manipulated us. We simply didn't know it. We didn't see what was right in front of us. Another executive stood, his expression fierce. I remember every acquisition he planned, every strategy he created, every deal he negotiated. I remember wondering who the genius was behind all our success. Now I know. Another. Every crisis he solved. Every problem he fixed. Every disaster he prevented. Another. Every negotiation he rescued. Every client he won. Every partnership he secured. Arthur slowly walked toward Julian, his alpha presence warm and supportive. I've waited a long time to say this publicly, he said, his voice full of emotion. Julian looked at him, his omega instincts finally calming. You never owed me anything. I did what I did because I believed in the company. I believed in the people. Arthur smiled sadly. I owe you the truth. He turned toward everyone gathered, his voice carrying through the silent ballroom. Years ago, when Blackwood Industries was collapsing, I asked an anonymous investor why they wanted no recognition. Why they didn't want their name on the documents. their face on the magazine covers, their success celebrated. He looked back at Julian, his eyes full of tears. He told me something I'll never forget. Julian lowered his eyes, suddenly unable to meet his father-in-law's gaze. Arthur repeated Julian's words, his voice soft with emotion. If the company survives, the employees keep feeding their families. The workers keep paying their mortgages. The families keep sending their children to school. That's recognition enough. The room became emotional. One employee quietly wiped away tears. Another whispered, "I never knew." A third bowed her head, her omega instincts overwhelmed. Arthur continued, his voice growing stronger. From that day forward, I knew exactly who my successor should be. I knew who had the vision, the courage, the wisdom to lead this company into the future. Sebastian stared at him, his alpha instincts in complete revolt. You planned this? All of this was planned. Arthur shook his head slowly. No. I hoped you'd become the leader I believed you could be. I hoped you'd grow into the alpha I saw in you. His voice grew heavier with disappointment. But leadership isn't inherited. Leadership is earned. And you haven't earned anything, Sebastian. You've taken, you've stolen, you've manipulated. But you haven't earned. The applause became louder, more sustained. Sebastian couldn't believe what he was hearing. He turned desperately toward Theodore. Say something. Tell them all this is ridiculous. Tell them. Theodore didn't move. His omega scent was bitter with regret. Sebastian walked over to him, his alpha instincts desperate. Theodore. Theodore looked at him for a long moment, his expression unrecognizable. You told me you built everything, he said quietly. You told me you were the one who saved the company. You told me you were the genius behind all the success. You told me you were the alpha who had everything. I did. No. Theodore shook his head slowly, his omega voice steady for the first time. You borrowed someone else's success. You pretended to be someone you weren't. You lied to me, Sebastian, just like you lied to everyone else. Sebastian grabbed his arm, his alpha instincts screaming at him not to let go. Don't leave. Don't do this. I can fix this. I can make it right. Theodore gently removed his hand, his omega instincts finally overriding his fear. You promised me a future. You promised me a life. You promised me a penthouse and a beach house and a life of luxury and security. I can fix this. I can fix everything. Theodore looked around the ballroom, his eyes settling on Julian. Can you? Can you really fix this, Sebastian? Look at him. Look at what he built. Look at what he sacrificed. And then look at yourself and tell me you can fix this. Sebastian couldn't answer. His alpha instincts were screaming, but there was nothing left to say. Theodore sighed deeply, his omega heart finally breaking free of the lies. I fell in love with the alpha you pretended to be, he said quietly. I fell in love with the successful CEO, the brilliant businessman, the generous alpha. I didn't realize he was the one carrying everything. He glanced toward Julian, his expression full of reluctant respect. I didn't realize he was the one who built the empire you were showing off. Sebastian's voice broke completely. Theodore, I'm sorry. I'm so sorry. Please. But Theodore wasn't speaking to Sebastian. He was speaking to Julian. I truly am, he said, his voice full of regret. I truly am sorry for everything. I didn't know. I didn't understand. I'm sorry. Julian nodded politely, his omega instincts recognizing genuine remorse. I hope one day you choose better, he said quietly. I hope one day you find someone who sees you for who you are, not what you can give them. Theodore's eyes filled with tears. Without another word, he quietly walked out of the ballroom, his footsteps echoing in the absolute silence. The enormous doors closed behind him. Sebastian stood alone for the first time all night. He had no one standing beside him. No father. No husband. No lover. No allies. Nothing but the hollow shell of the empire he had stolen. Just then, two members of corporate security approached. One of them spoke respectfully, his beta scent neutral. Mr. Blackwood. Sebastian turned, his alpha instincts finally accepting defeat. We've been instructed to collect your executive identification. The guard's voice was polite but firm. Sebastian stared at him in disbelief, his alpha instincts screaming to fight, to run, to do anything. You've got to be kidding. You can't be serious. I'm Sebastian Blackwood. I've been the CEO of this company for 15 years. You can't just... I'm sorry, sir. One guard held out his hand, his expression apologetic but unwavering. We have our instructions. After several long seconds, Sebastian slowly removed the gold executive badge from his jacket. He looked at it, the badge that had opened every office, every boardroom, every private elevator, every executive suite. The badge that had made him feel powerful, untouchable, invincible. He placed it in the guard's hand. It felt heavier than it ever had before, weighted with all the lies and betrayals it represented. The guard nodded politely. Thank you, sir. Sebastian looked toward his father one last time, his alpha instincts begging for a reprieve. Arthur didn't say a word. He simply closed his eyes, and a tear escaped down his weathered cheek. That silence hurt more than any lecture ever could. Sebastian turned and began walking toward the exit. The ballroom that had welcomed him with applause now watched him leave without a single word. Not a whisper. Not a goodbye. Just silence. Halfway to the door, he stopped. He looked back. Julian was surrounded by employees, board members, friends, people congratulating him, hugging him, thanking him. Not because he had defeated Sebastian, but because they finally knew the truth. Because they finally understood who had been carrying them all along. Sebastian realized something that shattered his alpha instincts completely. Julian had never wanted his position. He had never wanted the power. He had never wanted the recognition. He had only wanted respect. He had only wanted to be seen as an equal. And Sebastian had traded it all for his pride. The doors closed behind him. Outside, rain had begun to fall, cold and relentless. His driver walked toward him, umbrella in hand. Good evening, Mr. Blackwood. Sebastian looked at the company car, the one that had been his for years, and then back toward the hotel where his entire life had just collapsed. The driver cleared his throat, clearly uncomfortable. I'm sorry, sir. The vehicle now reports to the office of the Chief Executive Officer. I've been instructed to arrange alternative transportation for you. Sebastian gave a hollow laugh, the sound empty and bitter. Of course it does. The driver handed him a small envelope, sealed with wax. This was left for you, sir. At the front desk. Sebastian opened it with trembling fingers. Inside was a handwritten note, clearly in Julian's elegant script. There was no anger, no insults, no gloating. Just one simple sentence. The greatest loss isn't power. It's forgetting the people who helped you earn it. Julian. Sebastian read it again, then again, and again, until the words blurred with the rain on his face. He folded the note carefully and slipped it into his pocket, his alpha instincts finally quiet, finally accepting the truth of what he had lost. Back inside the ballroom, Arthur approached Julian, his expression full of emotion. I know tonight wasn't the birthday you deserved. I know this wasn't how you imagined your 35th year beginning. Julian smiled softly, his omega heart heavy, but not broken. No, it wasn't what I expected. He paused. But maybe it was what I needed. Arthur sighed, his alpha instincts full of regret. I'm sorry for everything my son put you through. I'm sorry for 15 years of lies and betrayal. I'm sorry for not seeing what was right in front of me. Julian gently shook his head. Please don't apologize for another alpha's choices. Sebastian made his decisions. He chose his path. You're not responsible for him. Arthur smiled, tears in his eyes. You still think about everyone else before yourself. Even now. Even after everything. Julian laughed quietly, a soft sound that seemed to release some of the tension in the room. Old habits. My mother always said I was too kind for my own good. Arthur looked around the room, at the applauding employees and relieved board members. The company is yours now. Truly yours. Julian corrected him immediately. No. He looked toward the employees who had worked so hard for so long. It belongs to every person who gave their best to build it. Every person who sacrificed for this company. Every person who believed in something bigger than themselves. The employees applauded again, louder this time. One young Omega stepped forward, her eyes shining with tears. "I've worked here for 7 years," she said, her voice trembling. "I almost quit twice. I was ready to give up on my dreams. And then you found me in the break room and convinced me to stay. You reminded me why I started working here in the first place." Julian smiled, recognizing her. "I remember. You were crying over spreadsheets." She laughed through her tears. "You sat with me for an hour. You showed me how to fix the mistakes. You told me I was capable of so much more than I believed." Another employee stepped forward. "And me. I was going to leave after the merger. I thought my department was going to be eliminated. But you fought for us. You made sure we all had positions." One by one, dozens of employees surrounded him, sharing stories, moments he had probably forgotten, small acts of kindness that had changed their lives. They spoke of encouragement, of support, of the quiet way he had helped them grow. Arthur watched quietly, his eyes full of pride. Then he whispered to himself, "That's what a leader looks like." 6 months later, Blackwood Industries reported its highest profits in company history. The numbers were staggering. Revenue had increased by 47%, market share had grown by 32%, and employee satisfaction had reached record levels. The company that had once been on the brink of collapse was now one of the most successful corporations in Europe. New scholarship programs were created for Omega students, funded entirely by company donations. Single-parent support initiatives were launched, providing childcare and flexible hours for working parents. Mental health benefits were expanded, offering counseling and support services to every employee. For the first time in the company's history, every employee, from executives to receptionists, received performance bonuses. No one was left out. The business magazines celebrated the remarkable turnaround. Julian's face appeared on dozens of covers, his Omega success story inspiring countless others. But Julian never accepted interviews that praised him alone. He always said the same thing, his Omega voice humble and determined. "A company grows when its people grow. I didn't build this alone. I just helped create the conditions for success." Arthur officially retired that summer, his alpha instincts finally satisfied that the company was in good hands. At the retirement ceremony, held in the same ballroom where everything had changed, Arthur stood before hundreds of employees. His voice was rough with emotion. "There is only one decision I regret," he said, his alpha presence filling the room. "One moment I would relive if I could." The room became silent. "I regret waiting so long to tell the world who the real leader was. I regret letting my son steal credit for someone else's work. I regret not standing up for what was right sooner." He invited Julian onto the stage, his hand outstretched. The standing ovation lasted nearly 2 minutes. Everyone was on their feet, board members, employees, friends, family. Everyone who had ever benefited from Julian's quiet sacrifice was finally giving him the recognition he deserved. As the celebration ended, Julian returned to his office. The corner office at the top of the Blackwood Industries Tower, with floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the London skyline. It was the office Sebastian had occupied for 15 years, but it felt entirely different now. It felt like his. He opened one drawer, the one where he had stored all the documents from that night. Inside lay the unsigned divorce papers, still sealed in their cream envelope. He looked at them for a long moment, his Omega instincts quiet and calm. Then he quietly closed the drawer. Some chapters didn't need to be reread. They only needed to be finished. Julian walked to the window, looking out over the London skyline. The city glittered below him, thousands of lights, thousands of lives, thousands of stories. His Omega instincts, once so wounded, now hummed with quiet satisfaction. He remembered Sebastian's face when the projector had illuminated the truth. He remembered Theodore's tears, Arthur's disappointment, the gasps of the crowd. But more than any of that, he remembered the moment he had looked at the divorce papers and decided not to cry. He had decided to win. Not through revenge, not through anger, through truth, through the power of being exactly who he was, without apology. His phone buzzed. A message from Marcus. You okay? You disappeared. Julian typed back. Better than I've ever been. Just needed a moment. Take all the time you need. We're all so proud of you. Julian smiled and placed the phone down. He looked at the photograph on his desk. His parents, taken decades ago, their Omega and Alpha bond strong and true. His mother had been an Omega too, fierce and brilliant and determined. She had taught him that Omega instincts weren't weaknesses, they were tools. Sharp, precise, powerful when wielded correctly. He remembered her words, spoken just before she died. Never let anyone make you small, Julian. Never let anyone tell you that being an Omega means being less. You are brilliant and fierce and worthy of everything this world has to offer. Don't ever forget it. He had remembered those words on the night of his birthday, when Sebastian had tried to destroy him. He had remembered them as he stood in the wreckage, building something new. And he remembered them now, as he looked out at the city he had helped shape. Julian Blackwood was an Omega. He was a CEO. He was a builder, a dreamer, a fighter. But most of all, he was someone who had chosen to rise. And that choice had made all the difference. The door to his office opened. Arthur walked in, his alpha presence warm and supportive rather than aggressive. I was hoping I'd find you here. You disappeared from the party. Julian turned, his Omega instincts relaxing in Arthur's presence. I needed some quiet. It's been an overwhelming evening. Arthur walked to the window, standing beside him. I remember the first time I saw you, he said softly. You were 20 years old, barely out of university. You came to my office with a business plan you'd written for a design firm. I thought you were just another ambitious young Omega with big dreams. Julian smiled, remembering. You were incredibly intimidating. I was. Arthur laughed softly. But you didn't back down. You looked me in the eye and made your case. And I thought, this Omega is going to change everything. Julian looked at him. That was before I met Sebastian. Before I fell in love with your son. Before everything. Arthur nodded, his expression somber. I know. And I watched you give up your dreams to save my company. I watched you sacrifice everything for a family that didn't always appreciate you. He paused. And I watched you become the leader I always hoped someone would be. Julian was quiet for a long moment. Do you ever hear from him? Arthur's expression softened. Occasionally. He's in New York now. Started a small consulting firm. He's not doing well, but he's trying. He paused. He asks about you sometimes. Julian didn't respond. His Omega instincts conflicted. Arthur continued. He told me he reads the financial reports. He sees what you've done with the company. He said, Arthur hesitated. He said you were always the better leader. He said he knew it the night it all came out. He said he had always known it, deep down, but he was too proud to admit it. Julian closed his eyes, the words washing over him. That's kind of him. It's not kindness. It's truth. Arthur turned to face him fully. I know you still love him. I can smell it in your scent. The bond is still there, even after everything. Julian opened his eyes, his Omega instincts finally accepting the truth of Arthur's words. Some bonds don't break easily. 15 years doesn't just disappear. Arthur nodded. I know. But love isn't the same as trust. And trust is what you build a life on. Julian looked out at the city again. I know that too. Arthur placed a hand on his shoulder. Whatever you decide, I'll support you. You're my son now, not by blood, but by everything that matters. By sacrifice and loyalty and love. Julian felt warmth spread through his chest, his Omega instincts finally satisfied. Thank you, Arthur. For everything. For believing in me. For trusting me. Arthur squeezed his shoulder. Get some rest. Tomorrow is another day of building something extraordinary. After Arthur left, Julian stood alone in his office. He thought about the unsigned divorce papers in his drawer. He thought about Sebastian's amber eyes, the way they had once looked at him with love and admiration. He thought about the 15 years they had shared, the laughter, the arguments, the nights spent planning the future, the moments of pure happiness that still felt so vivid. And he thought about the betrayal, the public humiliation, the attempt to destroy everything he had built. Some wounds healed, Others simply scarred over. Julian wasn't sure which category this belonged to yet. But he knew one thing with absolute certainty. He had survived. He had thrived. And he had done it not by becoming harder, but by becoming clearer. Clearer about his worth. Clearer about his boundaries. Clearer about the kind of love he deserved. The kind that didn't try to erase him. The kind that saw him fully and chose him anyway. He looked at the photograph of his parents one more time, then picked up his briefcase and walked out of the office. The building was quiet now. Most employees had gone home. The night shift workers nodded respectfully as he passed, their omega and beta instincts recognizing the new leader. He smiled at each of them, remembering their names, their stories, their struggles. That was what leadership meant, he realized. Not power, not prestige, not the corner office with the view of London. Connection, empathy, understanding. He walked out into the London night. The rain finally stopped, the stars beginning to appear through the clouds. He breathed deeply, his omega senses clear and calm. Whatever came next, he would face it. Not as the omega who had been humiliated. Not as the omega who had been betrayed. But as the omega who had chosen to rise. 1 year later. The gala was the event of the season. Blackwood Industries' annual charity dinner, raising funds for Omega education initiatives across the UK. Julian had made it his personal mission to ensure that no young Omega ever felt as alone and undervalued as he had once felt. He stood at the center of the grand ballroom, resplendent in a midnight blue suit that matched his silver blue eyes. His Omega scent was soft and confident, lavender and honey, but with an edge of something stronger now. Something earned. Something no one could ever take away from him. Around him, guests mingled, champagne in hand, laughter filling the air. The company had never been stronger. Employee satisfaction was at an all-time high. The scholarship programs Julian had launched were already changing lives, providing opportunities that had once seemed impossible. He was happy, not the desperate, clinging happiness of a young Omega trying to prove his worth. Not the fragile happiness of someone always waiting for the other shoe to drop, but the deep, steady happiness of someone who had found his place in the world. Someone who knew exactly who he was and what he was worth. Marcus appeared at his side, a glass of champagne in each hand. "You look like you're actually enjoying yourself," he said, his beta scent warm with affection. Julian laughed, the sound genuinely happy. "I am. Is that so surprising?" Marcus raised an eyebrow. "Given the last time we were at a gala together. Let's not talk about that." Julian took the champagne, his Omega instincts finally at peace. Marcus smiled. "Fair enough. But I have to say, watching you take that company to new heights has been incredible. You deserve every bit of this. Every single moment." Julian felt warmth spread through him. "Thank you. I couldn't have done it without you. You've been my rock through all of this." Marcus bumped his shoulder affectionately. "Flatterer. But I'm glad I could help." He paused. "So, have you thought about what you're going to do with those divorce papers? They've been sitting in your desk for a year." Julian's expression softened. "I'm going to sign them. I've been waiting for the right moment. Tonight feels right." Marcus squeezed his shoulder. "I'm proud of you. That's a big step." As the evening continued, Julian circulated through the crowd, talking to employees, donors, board members. Every interaction felt genuine. No one was trying to use him. No one was pretending to respect him while planning his destruction. He had built a new world for himself. And it was beautiful. Near the end of the evening, as the auction was winding down, a familiar scent hit him. Amber and cedar. Alpha. Sebastian. Julian's heart stuttered, then steadied. He turned slowly, his Omega instincts already analyzing every nuance of the scent. Sebastian stood at the edge of the ballroom, wearing a simple charcoal suit and looking older than Julian remembered. The arrogance that had once defined him was gone, replaced by a quiet humility that Julian had never seen before. His amber eyes found Julian's across the room, and something flickered in them. Regret, loss, love, all wrapped together in a scent that was surprisingly subdued. Julian excused himself from his conversation and walked toward his ex-husband. He stopped a few feet away, his Omega instincts calm but cautious. Sebastian. Julian. Sebastian's voice was rough, uncertain. I hope I'm not intruding. I know I wasn't invited, but I donated to the scholarship fund, and they sent me an invitation. I didn't think you'd mind if I showed up. Julian studied him, his Omega instincts detecting no deception. I don't mind. Sebastian nodded, visibly relieved. I've been reading about your work. Everything you've done. He paused. You've done amazing things, Julian. Things I could never have done. Things I didn't even know were possible. Julian's Omega instincts finally relaxed. Thank you. Sebastian took a breath, gathering himself. I know I don't deserve your forgiveness. I know I don't deserve anything from you. I hurt you in ways I can never take back. I humiliated you in front of everyone. I betrayed your trust. I destroyed everything we built. Julian was quiet, waiting. But I wanted to tell you. I'm sorry. For everything. For the lies. For the humiliation. For not seeing who you really were. For not appreciating what I had when I had it. Sebastian's voice cracked. For being such an arrogant, blind alpha that I couldn't see the treasure right in front of me. Julian felt his heart ache, not with love, but with memory. I know you're sorry, Sebastian. Sebastian looked up, hope flickering in his eyes. I should have told you years ago that I felt inadequate, that I felt overshadowed by your brilliance. Instead, I tried to tear you down. I tried to destroy you to make myself feel bigger. His voice broke completely. It was the worst mistake of my life. My worst failure. Julian was quiet for a long moment, letting Sebastian's words settle. I don't hate you, Sebastian. Sebastian looked up again, his alpha instincts hopeful. I don't hate you. Julian repeated, his voice soft. But I can't trust you. And without trust, there's nothing left. No marriage. No partnership. No future. Sebastian closed his eyes, accepting the words like a blow. Julian reached out, touching his arm gently. But I'm grateful for the good years. I'm grateful for the love we had. And I'm grateful that you tried tonight. That means something. Sebastian opened his eyes, tears streaming down his face. It does. Julian nodded. It means you're growing. It means you're becoming the alpha you always could have been. It means you're finally learning to be vulnerable, to admit your mistakes. Sebastian looked at him with something like wonder. You've always seen the best in me, even when I gave you every reason not to. Julian smiled, his Omega heart softening. Only when it's there. He released Sebastian's arm. Take care of yourself, Sebastian. As Julian turned to walk away, Sebastian spoke again, his voice desperate. Julian. Julian paused. I'll keep reading about your work. I'll keep being proud of you, even if you never know it. I'll cheer for you from the sidelines for the rest of my life. Julian smiled, his heart warm with gratitude. I'll know. He walked back into the crowd, leaving Sebastian standing alone at the edge of the ballroom. But this time, Sebastian wasn't surrounded by humiliation and defeat. He was surrounded by something else entirely. Respect. For the Omega who had built an empire. And for the Alpha who had finally learned to see him clearly. 3 months later, Julian stood in his office, looking at the divorce papers on his desk. He had signed them an hour ago, and now they sat there, sealed and ready to be filed. His phone buzzed. A message from Sebastian. I heard you signed the papers. I'm sorry for everything, but I'm glad you're moving forward. You deserve all the happiness in the world. Julian stared at the message for a long moment, his Omega instincts quiet and calm. Then he typed back. Thank you. I hope you find your happiness too. He put down the phone and looked out the window. The London skyline glittered below him. He was free. Not from Sebastian. He had been free from him for a long time now. Free from the need for his validation. Free from the pain of his betrayal. Free from the weight of a relationship that had been built on lies. He was free to be exactly who he was. And that was the greatest gift of all.